Good afternoon and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. I am Janet Lamkin, California State President of Bank of America and your chair for today's program. We also welcome our listeners on radio and television and invite everyone to visit us on the internet at commonwealthclub.org. Today we are pleased to present the Walter Hoadley Annual Economic Forecast, named in honor of the club's late past president and longtime board member, Dr. Walter Hoadley. Dr. Hoadley also served most notably as the chief economist and vice president of Bank of America. Today's program is sponsored by the Walter E. Hoadley Memorial Fund and Bank of America. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Robert Reich, professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, economic advisor to President-elect Barack Obama, and former U.S. Secretary of Labor under President Clinton. As Labor Secretary, Professor Reich implemented the Family and Medical Leave Act, led an international campaign against child labor, headed the administration's effort to raise the minimum wage, secured workers' pensions, and launched job training and school-to-work programs. And just recently, Time magazine voted him one of the 10 most effective cabinet members of the century. He is the co-founding editor of the American Prospect magazine, and his commentaries can be heard weekly on National Public Radio Marketplace. And somewhere in the midst of that busy schedule, he's found time to write 11 books, including 2 bestsellers. Please welcome Robert Reich.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Janet. Latest word is that the market is down 250 points. You know, when I talk about the economy these days, I see people with very glum faces, and I'm going to try to cheer you up reasonably, not with Pollyannish notions, but with a sane, realistic assessment of what's happening and why it has happened and where we are going. You know, I've got something of reputation. In fact, I think the reason I was asked here today is because of this reputation as being an economic soothsayer. I should warn you, it started in October of 1987. Does anybody remember what happened in October of 1987? How many of you remember that? Put up your... well, the first week of October of 1987, I was on a television broadcast opposite another economist, a conservative economist, who said that things were going wonderfully well. In fact, when asked what was going to happen to the Dow Jones Industrial Average over the next 3 weeks, he said, just unbelievably wonderful. He said, if you are in the market, don't even wait to the end of this program to call your broker and get in more deeply. Well, it came to my turn, and I disagreed. I said, well, I can't tell you over the long term, but certainly over the next months, it's going to be very, very bad. In fact, I believe, and there is a videotape of this program, I said, I believe that in 2 weeks, the market is going to lose 20% of its value. And if you're in the market, get out. In fact, don't even wait to the end of this program to call your broker. And 2 weeks later, sure enough, the market lost 20% of its value in one of those euphemistically called corrections. And I was deluged with letters and phone calls, people wanting to know how to sign up for my investment letter. I told them with some sadness that I did not have an investment letter. What I did not tell them or share with them, in fact, I haven't shared with anybody because I don't want to tarnish my reputation as an economic soothsayer, but seeing all of your faces and seeing that worried look on your face, I need to share this fact with you, and that is that prediction that I've made, that in 2 weeks the market would lose 20% of its value, I've been making exactly the same prediction for the previous 4.5 years. So I missed the bull market completely, which just goes to show if you stick to your guns, you can be a soothsayer and have your own investment letter. 2008, here's safe ground. I'm going to start out on very safe ground. 2008 was not a very good year economically. You all agree? The American economy lost about $7 trillion worth of assets. I don't know how you in this room did, but most Americans did not do well. And that is not a cause for levity. This is a cause for real concern. Many people who started out relatively poor or near poor or worried about being unemployed are now in worse straits. Nobody can escape the downdraft in this economy. And what will happen in 2009? Well, there may be a videotape of this presentation. And the problem with making economic predictions when there is a videotape or even an audio tape is that somebody has a record of what you said. But my prediction is that without effective government action, and I'll get back to what effective government action means, the unemployment rate, which is now 7.2%, that's the latest, will be up in the double digits, at least 10%, by the end of 2009. That we will have lost another 3 million jobs, at least. This year in 2008, we lost about 2.4 million. And the Dow will be languishing around 7,050. The real question, of course, happens or is about what happens in 2010 and what happens in 2011. Most of us can agree we are in a severe recession. The question is, when do we hit bottom and when do we come out of it? The nice thing about economic cycles, and here is cause for hope and cause for you all to be a little bit cheerier than you are looking right now. I don't know, you can't see yourself, but this is really depressing. The real cause for optimism, or at least for being not quite as negative as you are feeling right now, is that economic cycles, particularly as they near the bottom or when they are at the bottom, obey the obverse of Isaac Newton's law, which is what's down eventually comes up. They are cycles, after all. The question is, when do we hit bottom and when do we start going up again? In order to answer that question in a thoughtful way, you need to understand why we're here. How did we get here? And there are many different theories, but I'm going to give you the prominent theory, and then I'm going to take issue with the prominent theory. Here's the prominent theory. The prominent or dominant theory right now is that we had, as you all know, a housing bubble, and the housing bubble burst. And with the bursting of the housing bubble, a lot of Americans feel simply poorer than they were before. They thought their assets base. They thought they had more assets than they otherwise did. And now that they have fewer assets, or their assets are worth less, particularly their housing asset, which is the number one asset most people have, they feel poorer, and therefore they are holding back from the malls, and their confidence is down. And as they hold back from the malls and hold back from buying, then obviously businesses have to lay people off. And as they lay people off, that creates a vicious cycle, because then people feel more and more worried about the future. They have less and less money in their pockets, and thereafter they buy less, and that leads to fewer jobs. Well, that scenario, the dominant scenario, is not completely wrong, but it implies that the problem originated with the housing bubble. And I don't believe that the problem originated with the housing bubble. I think the housing bubble was a trigger for something else. Part of what it was a trigger for was revealing I don't think there's any other word for it than irresponsibility on Wall Street and among those who were supposed to regulate Wall Street. But even that doesn't get to the heart of the matter. I think the heart of the matter has to do with consumer incomes. Because if you go back 25 or 30 years, you see that something quite dramatic began to happen in the 1970s to median incomes. Now, people, when they talk, many people, they get averages and medians mixed up. In fact, I was listening not too long ago to a rather conservative economist who said, well, average incomes, certainly during the Bush administration, have gone up. They've soared. But you see, Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player, and I have an average height of 6 feet. Averages are pushed up by people at the top. What you want to look at is median. Median, that is the person halfway on the income ladder. And median wages since the 1970s and median incomes for the individual have actually languished. They went up a little bit in the 1970s and 80s, adjusted for inflation. And they went up a little bit more in the 1990s, adjusted for inflation, but not very much. And in this decade, for the first time in history, to the extent that we have recorded data about economies, we saw that in the United States, the median incomes actually dropped, even though it was an economic recovery for most of this decade. We've not had median wages dropping in an economic recovery. But the big story is that median wages, adjusted for inflation, have not done very much for years, even before this recovery. What happened? The economy has grown dramatically. What happened to median wages, and where did all the growth go? Who got all the money? Well, here's an interesting and again, very important story. Because beginning in the 70s, the wages of male workers in the United States, male, M-A-L-E, I don't mean male men or women, male workers in the United States, actually adjusted for inflation, began to stagnate and then decline. Now, some people blame foreign imports, some people blame new technologies that took away the jobs of relatively unskilled men. But up until then, it was possible for a family to do quite well with one breadwinner. Families beginning in the 70s and increasingly the 80s and 90s, and even in this decade, used 3 coping mechanisms to keep their incomes up so that they could spend. The first coping mechanism was for women to go into paid work. In the 1970s, women poured into the workforce. I wish I could tell you that the reason women went into work, paid work, women always work, but paid work, was because of all of the new professional opportunities opening to women. But although that was certainly the case, most women went into the workforce starting in the 70s, increasing in the 80s and 90s, because they had to in order to prop up family incomes that otherwise were declining. Coping mechanism number 2 was for families to work harder, men and women both, to work much longer hours. By the end of the 1990s, the typical American worker was putting in 350 hours a year more than the typical European worker. In fact, even more hours than the incredibly industrious Japanese worker. I came up with an acronym, a demographic term for these 2 income families that were working so hard. I call them DINS, D-I-N-S, double income, no sex. Hard to know how they or we procreate any longer, but... And then came coping mechanism number 3, which has a very important bearing on the housing bubble. That coping mechanism number 3, when the first 2 mechanisms were exhausted, was for families to go deeper and deeper into debt. And they went deeper and deeper into debt largely through using their increasing housing values as collateral. They refinanced, or they got home equity loans, And that deepening debt was of concern to some people and some economists and others who said Americans are living way beyond their means. But another way of looking at that was Americans' means had not grown, and therefore the only way of continuing their spending and maintaining their living standards was to go deeper and deeper into debt. When the housing bubble burst, so did that third and last coping mechanism. And we find ourselves with a severe problem on the demand side of the equation. That is, the purchasing power side of the equation. People just don't have the purchasing power any longer to buy all the goods and services that the American economy can produce. As we were walking in here, one of my table mates asked me, well, if that's the case, and I had been discussing this coping mechanism strategy, he asked, well, what happened to all of the income? The American economy grew very large during these years, particularly over the last 20 or 25 years. What happened to all the income? Well, here is a way of envisioning this, and I don't often share this particular point of data because it can be so easily misunderstood. As late as 1980, the top 1% of income earners in the United States were taking home 8% of total national income. But then, starting in the 80s, the top 1% began to take home a larger and larger percentage of national income. Until by 2006, the top 1% was taking home 23% of national income. So the answer to what happened to all the income is that it went to the top. Now, I've got to be very careful when I say this because I'm not implying that anybody was bad or nefarious or malicious. I'm not suggesting nonfeasance. I'm not suggesting that anybody at the top calculated scandalous ways of bringing home all that money. I'm simply saying that's what happened. Demand shifted dramatically in favor of those with skills, with connections, certain kinds of professionals. For all sorts of reasons, including the demise of labor unions and other countervailing forces in society, we saw that more and more income went to the top. The problem for the economy, once the dust settles, once the bubbles burst, is that the people at the top don't spend nearly as large a percentage of what they take home as people in the middle or near the bottom. That is, to be rich, it means essentially that you already have most of what you need. That's the definition of being rich. You've got most of what you want. And so inevitably you're not going to turn around and spend it. Hence, we find an increasing gap between what the economy is capable of producing in terms of goods and services and what people, after the bubble burst, are capable of buying without going so deeply into debt, and indeed now they can't go deeply into debt. In fact, to look at this entire problem from the standpoint of credit markets, I think suggests looking through the wrong end of the telescope. It's not that credit markets can't lend, it's that people can't borrow. So what do we do about it? Well, thank goodness we have a new president. You know, I met with him a couple of days after the election. He put together 15 or 17 of us to be a kind of economic transition team that would look over what the economic transition staff were doing. And he walked into the room 2 or 3 days, I think it was literally 2 days after the election. And he came into the room and I found myself choking up. There was our president-elect, Barack Obama, and he came up to me and I put my hand out and I thought, this is going to be very embarrassing if I start bawling. But all I could say was, thank God. What will the Obama administration do, and what's sensible to be done? Now, here, I want to make it very clear to you that I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the nascent, inchoate Obama administration. I'm giving you my views. It's helpful if you think about three large areas of public policy. Number one is the Federal Reserve Board. Now, that's not directly under the power of the president, not directly, indirectly, because the president appoints the Fed chair and the Fed governors, but that's will be, at least for the foreseeable future, Ben Bernanke's domain. But that's one very important domain of public policy. Now, the Fed, under Ben Bernanke, and Ben Bernanke, as Fed chair, has done remarkable things. No one expected the Fed to take the kind of responsibility it has already taken in the economy. Ben Bernanke was and is a student and a scholar of the Depression. He took the job before he knew how much his learning and scholarship would be relevant. But Ben Bernanke has turned the Fed not only into a lever adjusting interest rates up and down, depending upon how much the economy needs to be stimulated, but Ben Bernanke and the Fed have been buying at an astounding rate distressed, let's use the word distressed for want of a better word, assets that cannot otherwise be sold, assets that are like securities, mortgage-backed securities. Nobody knows exactly what they are worth. And Ben Bernanke and the Fed have been buying this stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if they bought municipal bonds that look bad. Imagine the Fed kind of accumulating all of this stuff, all of this, okay, I'll use a different word, junk, in exchange for Treasury bills. Now, this is off budget. When I last looked, it was about $2.5 trillion. It's hard when you talk in trillions because nobody knows what you mean. A billion is hard enough to envision. A million is difficult. But trillions, the mind begins to quiver and boggle. $2.5 trillion worth of basically stuff that is being accumulated by the Fed. Now, the second policy domain is the Treasury Department, and that's the Troubled Assets Recovery Program, so-called goes by the name of TARP. I always thought I've come to believe that that's a very appropriate name for it, because TARP, if you look in the dictionary, is something that covers things up. And this is the most opaque program you can imagine. At the end of September, early October, when Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson went to Congress and asked for $700 billion, you remember Congress was a little bit reluctant to give the money as a blank slate, a blank check, and finally did come up with some money, $700 billion, with some requirements, but it turns out that not very many of those requirements have been adhered to. A special panel appointed by Congress, along with the Inspector General of the Treasury Department, has found that there's been no real oversight. And Hank Paulson, who I think has been trying, in fact, I'm sure he's been trying to do a terrific job under very difficult circumstances. He did not expect any of this to happen. I've known him for 40 years. He's a very intelligent, very able man, but he's changed direction. And the public has no idea what has been done. And I think that it is fair to say, and again, this is my view, that the TARP program has been a miserable failure. Money has not got down from the banks to Main Street. It hasn't got to troubled homeowners. It has not got to small businesses. It has not got to students who need to take out student loans. It's simply not trickled down. This is the worst form of trickle-down economics. Instead, the money has been used to pay dividends to shareholders of these banks. It's been used for executive pay and executive bonuses. The money has been used by one bank to buy up another bank, and a lot of it's been hoarded. So one big decision coming up is what is going to happen to the second tranche. That's the first $350 billion went, to me, to my way of thinking, down a sinkhole. What's going to happen to the second $350 billion? and what conditions are going to be placed on that. And we can talk about that if you wish. And I think, by the way, the easiest and fastest way to help troubled homeowners, easiest and fastest, is to let them do with their primary residences what they can already do if they can't pay mortgages on their secondary residences, on their third homes, on commercial property, and that is go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Now, it's not that bankruptcy magistrates would necessarily be doing all of these troubled mortgage loans. It's that in the shadow of bankruptcy, you give people who are in danger of losing their homes more bargaining leverage with banks to renegotiate these loans. The third major area of public policy is the stimulus package. Now, I testified in Washington last week before the House of Representatives on what should be in this package and how big it should be. To my mind, given the gap between the capacity of the economy to produce goods and services at full employment and where we are right now, given that consumers and businesses have pulled so far back, to my way of thinking, you've got to have a stimulus package over the next 2 years of at least $900 billion, covering those 2 years. Not $900 billion each year, $900 billion over those 2 years. I may have been very conservative. Sitting next to me before the House panel, considering this, was a conservative economist who has, in his past lives, he's at Harvard, a very distinguished economist who has been an advisor to Ronald Reagan and other Republican presidents. He said that the stimulus ought to be at least $800 billion. Now, he spoke after I did, and when he said $800 billion, I thought that I had lowballed it. But if you consider that we have a $14 trillion economy when it is up to full capacity, and if you consider how much below full capacity we are now, that is, most of the estimates show that consumer and business demand is down maybe 6.5%, almost 7% from what it was a year ago. Then a back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests that over 2 years you might want to have, for safety's sake, $1.3 or $1.4 trillion of stimulus. Now, the stimulus that is being proposed by the inchoate, nascent Obama administration is far below that. It's about $800 billion a year, $500 billion in spending, about $300 billion in tax cuts. Why can't it be bigger? I expect it can't be bigger because I expect, again, just my view, that our president-elect wants to get a lot of Republican support. Not just to get it through Congress, but also so that Republicans feel some ownership of this, so that it's really a national effort, so it is a nonpartisan effort. But in trying to get Republican support, and also the support of fiscally conservative Democrats, known as Blue Dog Democrats, there may be a danger of just making this stimulus too small. Those of you who remember the 1930s, I don't think anybody here remembers the 1930s. Those of you who remember reading about the 1930s know that Franklin D. Roosevelt tried to stimulate the economy. He did meet John Maynard Keynes. They did have a meeting in the White House. It turns out that neither of them was very impressed with the other. Keynes came away from that meeting saying, you know, the president doesn't really understand anything I was talking about. And FDR came away from the meeting saying, I didn't understand a word he said. But in effect, Franklin D. Roosevelt did try to stimulate the economy, but did not do enough of it until we mobilized for war in 1941. And that generated so much demand that all of the factories and offices and people who had been unemployed were actually put to work. The economy got back to full capacity. And that lifted everybody's wages. Now, by 1946, we had a huge debt on our hands. And I remember my father telling me, from when I was a small boy, my first lesson in economics. I couldn't have been older than 5 years old. I reminded my father of this yesterday. He's now getting on 95 years old, and he still believes he was right in telling me this. He said, Bobby, he called me Bobby, he said, Bobby, you and your children and your children's children and their children will be paying the debts of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I didn't know what that meant when I was 4, but I knew it was pretty bad. Well, it turns out that in 1946, the debt to GDP ratio, that is the ratio of our total national debt to our total national product, was 108. That is, the total national debt was larger than our total national product. And many people, including my father, thought, well, that was going to be the end of the world. We'd never pay it down. We did pay it down. Today, the ratio of debt to national product is still below 50%, below 50. Now, that's not great. It would be nice if it were lower, but here's the important point that all of you need to remember. When you hear the fiscal conservatives start screaming that we're going too much into debt, the important point is that the debt-GDP ratio has gone down since the Second World War, and the major reason it has gone down is not because of less debt. It's gone down because of more economic growth, a bigger economy. It's the denominator, not the numerator. The only way we get back to more growth is by getting the economy going again. The only way we get the economy going again is by spending, and that necessitates borrowing. Now, here's the good news, and I knew you were waiting for the good news because I promised you the good news, and I will offer you this good news as a kind of a final act, a kind of crescendo, a kind of wonderful parting shot. In this country, we have had for years, with regard to our roads and bridges, our ports, our levees, our electric grid, we've had deferred maintenance. Our sewer and water systems, almost every economist who has studied the issue has come to the conclusion this deferred maintenance is crippling us. It is causing huge problems. Sometimes bridges cave in or water systems burst, but also our competitiveness as a nation and our standard of living is also crippled by all of this. Beyond this deferred maintenance, we also know that we need to expand broadband. We need to have better medical information technologies. And we also have got to invest in renewable energy resources, in solar and biomass and wind and other energy resources that don't depend on fossil fuels. Much of what I've just said in terms of deferred maintenance and broadband and energy grid and fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels, rather, and medical information technology, some of your eyes are glazing over, but bear with me. Much of this are public goods. That is, we can't rely on the private sector to invest because the benefits come back to the entire economy, not necessarily to any individual company. We have now the opportunity to make these investments, or at least a down payment on these investments. We have the opportunity for two wonderful reasons. Wonderful in a kind of ironic way. Number one, because we have such a gap between our productive capacity and the demand in the private sector from consumers and businesses. So we can get a twofer by investing in America, putting people back to work, and also getting on with the job of all of these public investments. The other big advantage right now is that we can borrow very cheaply. Everybody in the world, it seems, wants to put their money into T-bills. Why? Because everybody's looking for a safe haven. And T-bills are very safe everywhere around the world. So if we are looking for a time to borrow money and invest in our future, and get the double whammy award for investing at a time when we have a lot of people who need jobs and a lot of factories and offices that are otherwise empty and not put to use, we could not have picked a better time. And to make it even better, you ought to be rejoicing. You ought to be smiling, all of you by now. To make it even better, we have an understanding in the public that this is no time for partisanship. This is no time for the kind of squabbling and business as usual in Washington. We have a new president who was elected with the largest majority of any president in the last 36 years. We have a country that wants to get on with what needs to be done and is absolutely convinced that we've got to change our ways. There is a huge mandate. And so we now have the opportunity to do what we could not do before. And it is not just the areas I mentioned, it's also education, it's also health care, it's many other areas. We have an opportunity to begin doing what we could not do before. Some of you, I can read your faces, are now slightly happier. I don't need you to be inspired, I just need you to understand that the Dow is not the whole story. I don't mean to minimize how difficult this year has been or how difficult next year will be. I don't mean to in any way understate how bad the economy is and how hard it is for many of you and certainly for many of our fellow countrymen. I just mean to look for and state what ought to be the guiding principle for all of us is that now is an opportunity we have not had in decades. Thank you.
Our thanks to Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor, a professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California at Berkeley, and the author of the book Supercapitalism, for his comments today. I am Mary Cranston. I am the chair of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors and the senior partner of Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman, and I'll be moderating the audience questions today. And we have a large number of questions, so let's begin. I want to apologize in advance that we will not be able to cover them all. This is one of the largest outpourings of questions I've seen. You are listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program, and our speaker today is Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor, who is discussing national, regional, and global economic challenges for 2009. Professor Reich, you've been talking about the current economic crisis, and I want to just put one of the questions to you directly. Paul Krugman suggests we may be entering into the second Great Depression. And if so, what would a Great Depression look like in the 21st century, and how would it be different than the 30s, and what rules did we learn the first time around that will help us here?
How much time do we have?
You have about a half hour.
First of all, there is no agreed-upon definition of a depression. After the Great Depression of the 1930s, most people involved in public policy or economics stopped using the word depression because, frankly, it was depressing, and it scared people. Now, this deep recession that we are in, or if you don't like deep recession, call it liverwurst, or mini depression. I tried to call it a mini depression not long ago, and it scared too many people. Whatever you want to call it, it is unlike any recession we've seen in previous years, both in terms of the sharpness and severity of the downturn, but also the fact that most of our previous recessions were brought on by the Federal Reserve Board raising interest rates too high in terms of trying to overcome inflation. putting the brakes on so tightly that people stopped buying because they couldn't get credit. No, this is a huge asset bubble having burst. And the asset bubble, when I say huge, I mean it's much larger than anybody understood at the time. It is not just housing assets, but it's all the derivatives attached to housing. And once you get all of the derivatives, and those derivatives, by the way, have a lot to do with what happened to Wall Street over the last 5 or 6 or 10 years. The leverage that we never expected, some of us who looked at the data knew that there was a lot of leverage, and people were scratching their heads and wondering, how can Wall Street continue to function with this kind of leverage, making these bets? But I must say that I, among many, many others, assumed that Wall Street knew what it was doing. And it obviously did not. How to get out of this? Well, I've already talked a little bit about that. What are the lessons that we can learn from this? One that I have not mentioned is we need smarter regulation of Wall Street. Now, when I say smarter regulation, I don't necessarily mean more regulation. I mean smarter. What kind of regulation? Number one, we have to have better capital requirements for financial institutions. They cannot leverage themselves like they have. A lot of the leveraging was done off balance sheets. Number two, we've got to have better disclosure. Even a lot of big institutional investors did not know what they were actually investing in. Number three, we've got to get rid of conflicts of interest, like the credit rating agencies, who are being paid by the issuers of the securities that they rate. Talk about a conflict of interest. Number four, I think there should be some attention paid to how executives are paid. Maybe a rolling average of 5-year returns or 8-year returns, because all of the incentives now and recently have been on making huge killings with as much leverage as possible and making as much money as you can off of those huge bets, because you're raking in a portion of those bets, and then just basically moving on to the next big leveraged bet. Now, those will not completely solve the problem, but those are some of the lessons, hopefully, we've learned.
Thank you. As a follow-on question to that, if President Obama were to put you in charge of the stimulus program and generally steering our economy over the next couple of months, what would be the first 2 or 3 things that you would do?
Number one, you've got to get money back into the economy fast. What are the ways to do that as fast as possible, even before you move on to big public investments? Number one, unemployment insurance. Fewer than 40% of people who lose their jobs are covered by unemployment insurance. That's something that most of us don't realize. This is a program that came directly out of the New Deal, but given that so many people are now working part-time, and so many people have been only working for 1 or 2 years in their present job, even if they're working full-time, they do not qualify under most states for unemployment benefits. So I would expand unemployment benefits, get that money directly to people who need the money most, and will turn around and spend that money directly. Also, food stamps. Right now, food stamp benefits are very, very low. Expand that as well. I would consider lifting the 60-month limits, lifetime limits on welfare benefits. We've got a lot of very, very vulnerable people in our population who have exhausted that 60-month limit and desperately for their family's sake. This is the old Depression program. This is the old 1930s program for families with children who are otherwise going to be hurt by an economic downturn. I would expand the availability of welfare. I would also immediately give huge infusions of cash to states and localities, because the states and localities right now have a shortfall projected 2009 through 2011 of roughly $400 billion, $350 billion of that, the states alone. Now, that is a huge fiscal drag on the economy. States are either cutting services and cutting jobs, or they are raising taxes. Most states cannot go into debt by state constitution. And that kind of fiscal drag has the opposite effect of a stimulus. The best way of getting money directly into the economy, other than helping the poor and lower middle class and people who are very, very vulnerable, is to help states and localities and make sure that services, public services, are getting the people who need it.
Well, let's say you did such a great job at the federal level. The next thing you get appointed to is the same job for California. What would you do in California?
I'm a newcomer to California, so I take no responsibility. No, you know much better than I do what's happening in California. To me, it looks like a political problem more than anything else. Yes, the budget deficits have been rolled over from year to year, so you get kind of a gigantic budget deficit that is the product of, again, not being able to actually have a deficit. What do you call it here, a shortfall?
Yeah.
It is really quite large, and the legislature is at a standstill. There are ways of overcoming this, but that's for all of you, and I guess me, now that I'm a resident and voter here.
Professor Reich, you wrote a really interesting book called Supercapitalism, and I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. You were commenting in that book about how the global competition has been intensified by the increasing consumer spending and the impact that that business drive was having on democracy around the world. And obviously you wrote it in 2007, before things came to a crashing halt at the end of 2008. What implications or what changes would you have made in your book if you had foreseen 2008?
I think, Mary, I would have emphasized a little bit more, although I did emphasize quite a lot in that book, the role of lobbyists in preventing adequate regulation of capital markets. And in fact, I have an entire chapter on the role of Wall Street in stopping effective and sensible regulation of Wall Street. I think I probably would have spent more time on that subject. You see, again, one of the ironies of our democracy is that we have now in Washington, and I can tell you because I was there and I dealt with them every day, we have lobbyists for trade associations and for corporations. And those lobbyists are not in and of themselves bad. That is, they are informing our representatives of what needs to be done and what the truth is about various matters. But there is no countervailing power. It is not, as many of you think, as if there are a lot of lobbyists for unions and a lot of lobbyists for the environmentalists, and a lot of lobbyists for women's rights and for civil rights and for everything else. No. That might have been the fact and the case in the 1970s. But today, it is almost only business, corporate, and financial lobbies in Washington. And as a result, it is extremely difficult to effectively regulate business or financial markets. Some of you may have seen a few days ago a headline that said Citigroup has withdrawn its opposition to what is called a cram-down provision. That is basically what I suggested before, allowing people who have difficulty paying their mortgages to go into a kind of Chapter 11 or Chapter 13, technically, of bankruptcy. Well, why was it so important that Citigroup has withdrawn its opposition? Because Citigroup's opposition had stymied that piece of legislation. And the fact that Citigroup withdrew that opposition made headlines because it was one step, according to the senators who were interviewed, one step toward being able to actually do something for those homeowners. Now, why did Citigroup withdraw its opposition? Could it be that the federal government now, having given Citigroup $45 billion, the federal government now has a little bit more sway over Citigroup than it had before? Possibly.
I've got a number of questions here about social welfare, health care, and I was wondering if you could comment on the implications or policy recommendations you would have as we think about investing billions, trillions of dollars in stimulus money. What could we do to create a win-win for the reform of some of these basic systems?
Well, again, I don't know how much time you have, and this kind of a discussion can go into every possible area of public policy. I can tell you, here are some of the dangers. Number one, it is very hard for the federal government to spend a lot of money in a short period of time and spend it well. So there's got to be adequate oversight. There have got to be adequate criteria. There cannot be any earmarks. There cannot be, and the public must not see or understand that there is a lot of pork barrel spending. It's got to be transparent. People ought to be able to see on their internet exactly what's being spent for what or what is being proposed. The second danger is that it's hard to spend it quickly. Infrastructure normally takes time before bids are let, before contractors can organize themselves, before money can actually flow. The larger the project, the more ambitious the project, the more time it's going to take. Now, the response to that is we're not going to be out of this recession, depression, liverwurst anytime soon, and so let's get started. But it's still going to take some time. The third problem is that many infrastructure jobs and many high technology jobs, like alternative energy or medical information technology or broadband, they don't necessarily, are not necessarily available to relatively poor, relatively unskilled, or blue-collar people. And they're not necessarily available to women. Construction jobs often go traditionally to white males. High technology jobs often go to high-tech professionals who've been trained for them. So the question is, how do you get these jobs, all of these new jobs, to the people who really need them, instead of just bidding up the wages and benefits of the people who are already qualified for them? There's no easy answer to any of these questions, but I can assure you people are working on them.
Thank you. You're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program, and our speaker today is Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor, who was discussing national, regional, and global economic challenges for 2009. Professor Reich, I've gotten a number of questions that relate to income redistribution and your point about the stagnation of the median income. What would be your policy recommendations to address this issue, and what kind of taxing policies would be implicated in that?
Well, again, I speak for myself. I'm not running for office. I can say whatever I want. You know, the interesting thing is that when you're a private citizen, you have, if you are very lucky, you have a little megaphone, a little one. When you're a professor at a wonderful institution like UCal, Berkeley, Goldman School of Public Policy, you have a little megaphone. You can say anything you want, but not many people hear you. When you are in office, when I was a Secretary of Labor, when I was in the cabinet, I had a very big megaphone, but I couldn't say very much. So now I'm back to a small megaphone, and I can tell you exactly what I think. Look, with regard to the widening income gap, and by the way, the wealth gap is even bigger. There are only really two things that can be done, one short-term and one long-term. Short-term, we want to make sure that our tax system is progressive as possible. And we can have in this room, I think, a very interesting, if we had time, conversation about how to make the tax system more progressive. The second thing, longer term, is to have an educational system that enables all our young people, regardless of their family background, to make the most of themselves. And this includes early childhood education, and improving primary and secondary education. And also, not the least, making sure that people have access to our universities and that we maintain the quality of our universities. Now, that's a longer-term proposition, but if we don't do that, then 95% of what I've said this morning or this afternoon is irrelevant.
If I could ask you just a follow-on question about our education system, especially higher education. Many of the state colleges and universities were already under stress before 2008. Now it's becoming quite acute. We have private universities that are, and some public universities that are among the very best in the world, but what kind of basic changes do you think we need to ensure the continued viability of our top public institutions of higher education?
Money.
Yeah, where are we going to get that?
Look, I don't think there's any question that higher education in this country is the most successful part of our educational system. Students come from all over the world to partake of our higher educational system and its resources. But there's also no question that that higher educational system is declining relative to other higher educational systems around the world, even China's, that are getting more resources. More resources for laboratories, more resources for salaries, for professors. I have a slight bias, I suppose, in making that particular claim. But the point is, and it's just as relevant to teachers in primary and secondary schools, human capital, even though people will do all sorts of things for the love of it, is not simply based upon one's love or one's belief. It is also, to some extent, based on supply and demand. And the laws of supply and demand are not repealed at the classroom door. If we want talented people to go into teaching, we've got to pay them enough. Women used to have a very limited number of professional opportunities. Before the 1970s, women could be nurses, they could be teachers, and that was pretty much about it. But once the professional opportunities opened to women, starting in the 1970s, then society no longer got the great benefit of all of those women who were essentially underpaid in terms of supply and demand. Now they could do many, many, many other things. So if we want talented women or men to go into teaching, primary and secondary school teaching I'm talking about right now, we've got to pay them enough.
You're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program, and our speaker today is Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor, who is discussing national, regional, and global economic challenges for 2009. Professor Reich, I got a question about what you think is going to happen to the junk that's now in Treasury.
Well, I use the term junk advisedly. I mean, the fact of the matter is nobody really knows what these things are worth. There are a lot of mortgage-backed securities or other collateral, and when the economy is stuck as it is, and when credit markets are as frozen as they are, and when much of these securities, many of these securities were put together like sausages. That is, they have inside of them mortgages that are unlikely to be paid back, and some mortgages that are going to be paid back, and other IOUs that will be paid back, and other IOUs that won't be. And so it's very difficult to assess what's in there. Some of it is pure junk. Now, what Treasury hopes, and what the Federal Reserve also hopes, is that when the economy returns, and it will go up, again, what goes down eventually comes up, what will happen is that many of those assets will be worth at least as much as taxpayers have paid for them. And taxpayers, therefore, will not take a beating. Who knows? It's a guess. Personally, I thought that Ben Bernanke's and Hank Paulson's original idea that they came forward with at the end of September, beginning of October, that they would use TARP to hold a kind of reverse auction. You know, the way that happens when when airlines overbook. You know, we will give you who will come forward for a round trip to the Bahamas. Well, and they will continue to raise the stakes until somebody comes forward. Well, that reverse auction could be a pretty good way of kind of smoking out what the banks think the value might be of some of these otherwise very hard to value securities. But as you remember, Paulson gave that up, gave up the whole reverse auction idea, and said, no, won't work, we're going to recapitalize Wall Street instead. Why did Paulson make that U-turn? I suspect Paulson changed his idea because he began to see that a reverse auction would price so many of the bank's securities so low that we would discover that many of our nation's major financial institutions were technically insolvent. And that would further disrupt markets. Well, I think we're going to have to just get more creative with TARP 2 and also with Federal Reserve acquisitions of all of this stuff. Maybe we have to re-examine what's called the mark-to-market rule.
What do you think President Obama should do right away with respect to the TARP program? Obviously, it's certainly your view that it's opaque and it hasn't been properly executed and the oversight is not what it should be. What could Obama do to fix that in the short run?
Again, my view, there is a contradiction at the heart of TARP. And that contradiction is the following. On the one hand, the Treasury and the government in general wants financial institutions to be liquid enough, to have enough money, both to repay the government and also to go on doing all the things that financial institutions need to do. They want them to be liquid and solvent. On the other hand, the federal government wants financial institutions to make loans, some of which are inevitably going to be risky in this environment. But there is a little bit of a tension between the two. If the financial institutions make the risky loans, they may be less solvent than they are now because they've already made a lot of risky loans. So how we exactly square that circle over the next couple of weeks is going to be very interesting to see. I suspect that Barney Frank at the House Banking Committee, among others, is going to make it a condition for getting the second tranche of TARP, that next $350 billion, that banks agree that a certain percentage of it has got to go to troubled homeowners, that a certain percentage of it has got to go out directly to loans, to Main Street, however you want to define that, and that there cannot be dividends and big executive pay and bonuses and big financial acquisitions. But that's going to be a very, very difficult set of criteria to boil down into legal language and to supervise.
We have unfortunately reached the point where there's time only for one more question. So let me ask you this one. A year or so ago, we were talking about the demographic trends and the shortage of labor, and obviously the economy has changed that picture, at least in the short term. What do you think the ripple effect of unemployment will be on our economy, and what would be your policy perspective on immigration from other countries as part of our economy?
Well, with unemployment already at 7.2%, and by the way, that is just people who have said to the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveyors, I'm not now looking for work, or I am looking for work, I'm not now employed. It does not include all the people who are too discouraged to look for work. It doesn't include all the people who are working part-time who'd rather be working full-time. If you include all of those underemployed people, the actual unemployment rate today is closer to 12%. And it is likely, if we don't have effective government action over the next year, to reach 15 or 16%. There is a negative multiplier with that, of course, because people who don't have jobs and don't have income can't turn around and buy, but also every one of those people who loses a job or doesn't have a job knows 5 people who are worried about losing their jobs because that person has lost a job. And that reduces the ability and willingness of people to basically spend. Psychology and economic reality are absolutely intertwined. And let me just say in conclusion, since I think this is the conclusion. Is that right?
That's right.
How did I know? The Pollyannas will say to you, the economy will turn around certainly by the end of 2009, and definitely by the start of 2010. This is, at worst, a year, maybe a year and a half, severe recession, but inventories are being drawn down. They have to be replaced. Consumers are going to have to replace their cars eventually and other major consumer durables. And so this is just a scary, bad, but it's cyclical in the sense that it will pop up. Those are the Pollyannas. I think they are wrong. That's why I characterize them as Pollyannas. The Chicken Littles at the other side say this is another 10-year problem. This is like Japan's lost decade. This is like the 1930s. We are just going to be in the muck, in the mire, and it's going to get worse, and it's certainly not going to get better, and woe to all of the people like me who are looking forward to retiring in the next 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 years. Forget it. I think the reality is somewhere between those poles. I think this is a severe, hard recession. I think that if we do all the things we ought to do, we collectively, and our new government does it, and we do it in as nonpartisan way as we can, and we make a down payment on the public investments we do need to do anyway, that this is likely to be 2 or 3 years. And on that upbeat note, I thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you. And I want you to join me in thanking Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor, professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and author of the book Supercapitalism. We also want to thank our audience here as well as on radio.